5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to Life in the Foam. I'm Clinton, and this is the podcast about life outside of major media bubbles. In a world where anyone can just connect to anyone, you can ignore the news, you can create your own little fantasy. You can peek on the window in the world any way you want, or any way which gets prepackaged for you by someone else. It's my distinguished pleasure to be joined by Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, who teaches history at the University of Chicago. And she's agreed to come on and to talk to me today about the Classic Trivium. The Classic Trivium was basically the bedrock for Marshall McLuhan's thinking regarding media and regarding his own sort of style of psychodynamics, I guess, just to pull a word out of the air, because he really saw the human mind as the interplay between dialectic, which is logic, and rhetoric and grammar, which would respectively be talking to people and convincing them of your arguments, and also grammar in his sense was more reading the meaning out of text and out of the Book of Nature, which is something I think he got from Sir Francis Bacon. This is all very new to me, so I'm very happy to have you here. Please do.
I'm happy to be here.
Give me some context on this sort of thing.
Sure. That's my dog. That's Joy.
Oh, hi, Joy.
She has Joy.
Oh, wonderful. This is probably a little different than most of the interviews you do, because I'd really like to dig into the meat of medieval studies here.
Well, I'm happy to say people have been asking me about Mary, but asking about Mary gets to the trivium as well, so that's good.
Splendid. Yeah, you just released a book on Mary. What was it called?
It's Mary and the Art of Prayer, The Hours of the Virgin in Medieval Christian Life and Thought. And if you're curious, one of the ways that we get to the trivium through Mary is, of course, she's the mother of the Word, right? The incarnate Word.
Mm-hmm.
In the Middle Ages, that was understood to mean she's also the teacher of the language arts, the magistra of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, because, of course, she gives birth to the Word.
Right. Of course. No, that makes perfect sense within this like theological frame, which I guess Christianity would have been providing, like the main book, which was being what's the word, exegesized? Well.
So exegesis is just the Greek term for interpretation, right? So it's reading. It's what you're saying McLuhan would think of as grammar in the sense of getting the sense. Right. Mm-hmm. So, but exegesis, it's the idea is it's reading out. The X in the Greek is the out, right? So reading out, whereas eisegesis, sometimes people accuse medieval Christians of doing eisegesis, reading into things, what they wanted to find. That's not what they think they're doing. They think they're drawing out the meaning. And they could do it on a number of different levels of history, allegory, moral readings, and sort of prophetic readings of what's going to happen in the end times. We're not talking about you, my sweetheart. So that's what exegesis is. Yes.
I've never heard that word.
I'm sorry she's going to do this. I don't know why she's decided to join us today.
Oh, that's fine. Three's company.
No, it's three's a dog and two people trying to have a conversation.
I've never heard the word eisegesis, you said.
Right, that's a sort of reading into. It's usually used as an accusation, saying that you are finding things in the text that aren't actually there. Which you could say, I mean, the postmodernists would love it, right? It's like they say there's no meaning in the text, you can put in whatever you want. I don't agree with them, but anyway. So where would you like to start? I have whole lectures on this if you want me to jump in, but let me hear what you would like me to talk about.
Okay, sure. McLuhan goes on a lot in his book, the Gutenberg Galaxy, about how the iconography of say, a stained glass window or a church from this period has all of this symbolism, which is sort of a rendition of the contents of the scripture for maybe the illiterate. who nevertheless need the memory aids in which to carry around the stories of the scripture in them in a different form, since they're not reading, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I find that interesting because that's sort of like, that makes me think of memes today on the internet, to kind of make a massive jump, the extra added non-literate, to use McLuhan's term, not to say you can't read, but that you don't read, illiterate. Like, there's a large number of people who, in this, free world where you're free to do whatever you want, aren't going to pick up books very often, right? And so that's sort of what McLuhan was getting at by a return to oral culture with television.
Okay.
And also with the internet today. So I'm wondering if you see any parallels between that religious form of you got the book, and then you've got the surrounding, the accompanying symbolism in all these different forms.
Right.
Do you think that lines up at all?
I think that's lovely. And so let me unpack several layers there for you. One, you have the iconography in those windows, and McLuhan's actually wrong, but not drastically wrong. There is this conviction that pictures are the books of the illiterate. They're not really. It doesn't work quite that way. So I want to explain that in a moment. And the other is when you're bringing in memes and the way people use them and how they think about them, that I would place them as also with comic book art, that you have a text image. Memes always have both, right? That they, or most. Is that true? They always have both. That it's an image with a text, right? And so that's an interesting sort of problem. So okay, let's start with those stained glass windows and the way in which they're demonstrating a reading of scripture. They would not be comprehensible to people who had no background, and that's one of the things that is sort of tricky about. There's what McLuhan is quoting is this phrase from Gregory the Great, who claimed in a letter, forgot who he was writing to, that picture art, narrative art, as it was developing in the West in the 5th and 6th centuries, were the books of the illiterate, right? And that you could use them as a preacher in instructing people in the stories, the history of salvation by way of pointing to the pictures. He was defending it against a sense that having pictures is inappropriate, and there is a sort of problem in Christianity that commandment not to make images. But with the incarnation, and so all of this is going to end up theological no matter where you take me, right? Because it always does. With the incarnation, it's possible, therefore, to make images, right? Because God takes on flesh, God becomes incarnate, the Word becomes flesh, and therefore visible. And Mary comes into this because it happens through her, right? So the incarnation, she becomes the mother of the Word, as I said, but it's the incarnate Word, so it's the visible Word, so it's the Word that you can make pictures of. In the East, they have a big debate over this in the 8th and 9th centuries. Iconoclasm, right? With an anxiety about whether it's actually appropriate to make pictures. In the West, what's interesting is they never quite have the same idea of icon as develops in the East, that the East develops a very high theology of a picture is possible of Christ, for example, because even though it's showing him physically, visibly incarnate, it still references his divinity. And that was in the East, that there was that concern that if you're making an image of Christ, you can only represent the man, right? That you can't also like capture the divinity in some way in art because it's physical and material and so forth. And that's what icons have this, like I said, very high theology in trying to understand that image prototype relationship. In the West, they don't care in the same terms about the problem of representing God. And there's interesting responses in the 8th and 9th centuries from the Carolingians, those Easterners. What are they fighting about? In the West, we use images to tell these stories, to make these arguments. Now, the pictures, the stained glass windows that McLuhan is talking about have narrative elements, and certainly in places like Chartres, which is the great cathedral in France that has its entire image cycle still preserved, right? A lot of the glass has been lost in the cathedrals, but Chartres still has its windows. You see stories. But the problem is they're also already embedded in a particular reading of Scripture that puts stories of the Old Testament in relationship with the New, stories in the New Testament in relationship with miracles and other narratives that, in fact, someone literally illiterate wouldn't be able to understand them, right? Now, and also they're hard to read because they're actually fairly high up, and it's sort of a mystery how you could use these in a sermon. What we do know is that preacher, you can take images like those, and particularly one of the things I'm very interested in is monastic diagrams that are clearly used for this kind of teaching, but they're getting meme-like, right, in the sense that they're usually texts with inscriptions that it takes a fair degree of unpacking to understand. And if you think about the way memes work and how excitable people are around memes, it's not in fact true that memes travel without a literate substrate, as it were, right? They are references, right? They're jokes pointing to whole layers of conversation that people are already in, much of which taking place on the internet. So it's in fact taking place in words. And they're like distillations of incredibly complicated arguments, and for those of us who enjoy them, that's why they're funny, right? Because you were pointing to something, the NPC ones right now.
Sure. Yeah.
A guy, the sort of cartoon character in gray labeled NPC, and that's, the way the liberals are behaving or something like that. That makes no sense, right? You have to be completely deeply embedded in this whole conversation about whether or not people are carrying their proper arguments, whether they're thinking them through, whether they're just parroting what people say. All of that is deeply, deeply embedded in a very complicated argument. And therefore, that's why McLuhan's wrong, right? It's like so were the pictures that he's pointing to and saying this is what the illiterate use to understand the Bible. No, it isn't. This is what very, very well-educated medieval Christians used to distill down a wonderfully complex understanding of the intricacies and networking and arguments of Scripture as a representation of reality that carries with it the truths of salvation history, in which you as a soul, this is the tropological level, are called to respond to these stories and model your life on them because they point you to the full vision of God that you have at the end times. I have just in that sentence given you basically the 4 levels of Scripture. You don't understand it, I'm suspecting. And memes work at that deeply encoded level too, right? Which is why people who see them and don't get that get angry, right? Because they don't understand the gaming culture that the NPC joke is coming out of. They don't understand what it means to interact with those NPC characters. None of that, right? So. Right. That's why McLuhan, that sort of books of the illiterate thing is misleading, because the images that you see in medieval art are as deeply embedded in a very complicated conversation as memes are.
I see. That's very enlightening. No, yeah, because
that's why I had mini lectures on all of this. I'm sorry.
That's great.
I'll jump in if you need me to explain something further.
So there's this idea of oral culture and literate culture, and so what you've described is sort of the distillation or the compression of a whole string of words, right, which would be the Scripture, down into like a mythic expression of its key forms, to have one icon or symbol which resonates at every different level as possible, have the simplest image as possible, which resonates at every sort of level of the thinking of the person in a way which gets underneath their linear rational thought, and they see the image and it just sparks and they go, yeah, I get it instantly, right? I see the NPC meme, I get that it's Wojak, I get that it's a video game character, I get it's supposed to be all the droning people who are quoting talking points they got from the television news, whatever, right? This is sort of the oral culture, which
See, the oral and literate don't help, right?
No.
And I think if you say, so what you were getting there is like the linear thinking, right? We think of text as having a sort of linearity, right? Because it is, right?
Yeah.
It's a linear form. Whereas images, and I like the way you said that, they are holistic in that sense. They spark all sorts of associations and links, and they exist. Instead of temporally like text does, they're sort of geographical, right? So space and time, and that's why I said with the memes that they draw on a concept of comic book art, which I think you probably already know. Do you know Scott McCloud's books on understanding comics?
I haven't read Understanding.
No, you don't. Okay. So he actually, I think he's influenced by McLuhan as well. I don't remember precisely, but his wonderful insight in talking through understanding comics is saying, they carry certain kinds of stories. They're really good at superhero stories, and he constantly tried to do. He always talked in his more theoretical books about how if only comics would do something other than superhero stories. But when he wrote his own comic Zot, it was still a superhero story. So recognizing that somehow this embodied form, right, this incarnational form, the word become image, carries a particular kind of story, which is the individual hero, right? Which you could say is a lovely vision of what the incarnation is. It's Christ become incarnate into the world in a story. And that's the kind of thing that comic books are actually really good at showing. But that they have this twinning of image and text because you can label them, or the characters can be given speech. McLeod talks through wonderful ways in which the panels and the gaps, but he has a whole chapter on just the gaps between the panels and the way you fill in all sorts of things as you're reading, right? There's picture, gap, picture, and you are engaged in filling in the hermeneutic gap. Mm-hmm. Yay.
Yeah. No, it's perfect.
In reading comics, right? Because you are and this kind of leap, right? This ability to go from one picture to the other and know what's happened in between and fill in the significance, from the solemn image to the joke image, from the one movement to the next movement to, the sort of all of the craft that goes into making those sequences of pictures. That fits very, very well with the way in which medieval commentators, exegetes understood the problem of understanding scripture, right? It's like it's these series of images, and you as the understanding mind interact with it in a very dynamic way that you are filling in those connections, right? So say you have a story of King David that you're reading in the Old Testament, as a Christian reader that that's also a story about Jesus Christ, right? Because David is understood as a figure of Jesus. So the things that David does in his own life point to things that are fulfilled in Christ's life. That, and it works, the two testaments work together throughout. So stories about Solomon, stories about Job. Job is a very Christ-like figure. Stories, the ways in which, say, Isaiah talks about the suffering servant. All of these things are mapped one from the other, from the Old Testament reading into the New Testament fulfillment. And that sort of leap across that gap is what Christian commentators are engaged in. That's also what they're showing in all of that imagery that McLuhan is pointing to, that they're trying to show you the way in which one figure is fulfilled in the other. So there'll be an image of, for example, Moses in the desert puts up a pillar and puts this bronze serpent on it for the people to look on when they've been bitten by snakes, and looking on this bronze serpent heals them of their snake bite. That is taken as an image of what happens to Jesus at the crucifixion. He's lifted up on the cross, and in medieval art, he's often shown as sort of twisty, like he'll be kind of like, his legs are all twisty and stuff, and it's like, well, why? You don't need to do that. It's showing him as the twisted serpent lifted up. That takes away the venom of now, and that moment that you just had is that sense of revelation, right? That realization that you now see the pattern, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what medieval Christian art is trying to do. It's trying to get you to that moment of realizing the pattern, the relationship. It's very like meme culture because you're also doing that, right? You told me stuff about that meme that I didn't know, right? I didn't know what it's an act. The guy, that character is actually from a particular video game.
It's from anonymous image board culture. He's
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have a greater depth of understanding of all of that as a joke than I do because I didn't know that, and that's what medieval preachers are constantly trying to show the laity to whom they're preaching how all of that layering of imagery works. So they put it in images, on the sculptures and in the glass, but it has to happen at the verbal level too, where the preacher who is trained in the reading of the scriptures can show you how all of those cascading layers are working. So to claim that it's an oral versus literate culture is completely misunderstanding it. It's a literate culture that is communicated orally and then given new form in images. And it's a very I haven't read much McLuhan, and you're going to help me understand it a bit better, so maybe I'm caricaturing it. But an easy divide between oral and literate simply doesn't work here. It's Christ became incarnate to speak to us in human language. That's written down. Preachers then take that written down version of what Christ said, for example, in the Gospels, and speak it back out, right? So there's a lot of reincorporation of orality and literacy both ways.
All right, yeah. McLuhan built a lot of this stuff on Walter J. Ong, who then wrote Orality and Literacy. And the idea is that in oral culture, I don't want to put this. It's a very delicate thing to explain, but with oral culture, the word lives, or the environment itself, speaks, and your words are the thing. There's no notion of words as a signifier, as detached from the thing, right? You don't actually have an interiorized voice or an inner imagination which is separate and apart from the immediate world which your senses are taking in. So to say a thing is to have power, right? To speak a thing is to instantiate it into the world, since it's very superstitious, right? You don't want to, say the wrong thing or it will happen and then it's your fault, right? There's no idea of the idea that you can just have a bull session and say things that you don't mean, right? Because everything is immediate. That is a rock. Rock is not a word. There's no such thing as a word to refer to rock, right? Rock, list that, right? It's all this. That's the idea, the notion. So somehow with rapid electronic technology and with iconography everywhere and with images, and also with our ability now to all of us can be an artist. Like the tools for creation of and multimedia is at everyone's disposal right now, in a way that even 50 years ago you couldn't just pick up a camera and go make a movie like you can today, right? You couldn't just publish a comic book or a zine until the Xerox photocopier was created a few decades ago, right? So all of these crazy rapid changes in the process of human communication, like there's that joke about how interpretive dance, like, if to show you how I feel, you got to sit there and watch me dance for 30 minutes, right? Like, like, so just this vast explosion in the capability for human expression is not a return to the sort of orality of a long time ago, but it's a new form where literacy, where the ability to turn things into words and to speak in long flowing, elaborated, well-crafted sentences, to keep things strictly to the words as expression, that's the word has lost its constitutive power to bring order into a world where everyone gets by communicating through images, or communicating through memes, or communicating through how they dress, right? Style, right?
Okay.
Can't you see who I am? Like, look at the clothes I put on, right? By 1970, McLuhan was saying that everyone should become a role player on the global theater. I suppose it's kind of a Shakespearean sort of allusion, right? Right? It's like, so... Yes,
which undoes his own argument, but yeah, okay.
So yeah, he thought that since the Gutenberg press for 500 years, everyone was, well, not everyone, but just the people whose works were constituting the fabric of reality were hyper literate and hyper rational, and they invented machines, and their dialectic was unmoored from their rhetoric or their grammar. They couldn't quite see what was going on, but the logic they had, they could instantiate it into machines, instantiate it into creations, run the whole world like a big assembly line, create the industrial era. And now,
Right.
boom, now everyone wants to feel again, and everyone wants to be part of this fabric, and you get the hippies and all that stuff. And then the word itself kind of loses its primacy over music and art and all that gushy, more artistic other media.
Had he ever listened to Beethoven? Okay, so
Go for it.
Oh,
Jump in.
no, that's wonderful. You've done that very well. And by way of your beautiful exposition of his argument, you've disproved it. But no, because one of the things that's happening is we're sitting here having this long form argument, discussion, argument, whatever. You just disproved his point, which was you gave a very beautiful, linear, persuasive, spoken version of a fairly complicated argument, right? So in a medium which is made possible by the digital age that he said was destroying it, right? So I think that it's wonderful that we get to have these kinds of conversations now. The many things that I've heard Jordan Peterson say, one of the best is, YouTube is changing something, right? It's like we've gone from a context in which the only way that you could get, sort of long, elaborate, verbal explanations of things was in writing, and thanks to the video culture that we're now in, which is no longer constrained by the bandwidth that McLuhan was dealing with the television, right? It's like that was very, very constrained. Radio, I think he's missing out radio if he doesn't think that people were doing long form verbal performances in his day, right? But that with YouTube, obviously, and this kind of streaming video, we are now, in fact, more reincorporated into the longer tradition than maybe people were before you could perform a speech to a large audience. And yet, I mean, this is where the sort of literate arguments are always only partially true. Okay, so you were talking about the orality and literacy. Go back to that. One of the fictions, and this is a historian I'm always sort of tickled by, is we have zero idea what people thought about orality until there was writing, right? It's like you are fantasizing a world that you have literally zero access to from antiquity. Before there was writing, people thought this, that, and the other. It's like, how do you know?
Yeah.
All we have is their writing, right? So
Yeah.
it's philosophically, self-destructive. And there's also what you were saying about, the word had no separation from its object. Theology. And Walter Ong was actually, he was theologically sophisticated. And again, I think I'm getting some of these arguments secondhand. One of my professors in college was working a lot with Ong's theory of orality and literacy. This is Werner Kelber, who worked on the Gospel of Mark, and was very interested, and therefore taught me some of this argument, very interested in the way in which you could see in the Gospel of Mark the sort of oral underlay of memory work. And then the Mark as an author comes in and gives it a particular kind of structure. Well, that's nice, except for all we have is Mark, right? So you really don't know what was there in the memory culture that enabled the authors of the Gospels to give us Christ's words, right, or Jesus's words. Another layer, which has been very interesting in medieval studies, is the work that Mary Carruthers has done on memory and memory training, that created this very orally sophisticated and visually sophisticated culture that I've been telling you about. That the preachers, who we know were the people who were behind creating those images that we started with McLuhan talking about, were very highly trained in memory. Thomas Aquinas, possibly the most, I don't know who wrote most in the Middle Ages, very prolific. Thomas Aquinas could dictate 5 books at once, right? He had 5 scribes sitting there taking his words down from memory, right? Things that he had memorized, the scriptures, the classics, the fathers, ordering them into his incredibly sophisticated theological system. And he'd have 5 guys sitting there with wax tablets and styly, copying down what he was dictating orally. Which is it? Is it oral or written, right? And that's one of the things we in medieval history are quite sensitive to now. It's the degree to which the literate education of the Middle Ages, and we're going to get to the trivium eventually here, was highly memorial, in the sense that you'd read a book in order to incorporate it into your own memory, right? And you wouldn't really know a book unless you had memorized it and could speak it, right? So where's Mary Carruthers' book on this is called The Book of Memory, right? It's like books were written in the Middle Ages to be memorized, to be available orally, which is therefore not really what we tend to think of reading for now, right? We think of it as this thing that you own, the book that you own on the shelf. I have this book, I've read it. It's there on my shelf. Well, in the Middle Ages, they wouldn't have considered you to have read it, right? Because you didn't know it properly.
I see.
There's several layers left there, but let's go with what I've just said.
No, that's great. So you've got, say, like Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad,
right?
Pre-Plato and pre-Aristotle, and I'm getting all this from Ong and from McLuhan. The idea is those were memorized, right? And it was all the training that you needed to be a proper Greek citizen was inherent within these epic poems, right? And so there'd be these poets, these orators, who were through the act of mimesis. See, this is through the act of mimesis, right? You are Achilles, and then the audience feels it and they become it, and there's a sense of like merging with the character. And this was the memory aid, right? You remember the poem and the lessons of it because you were that character in this sort of way that not just the words of the poem fill you up, but it's not just the words, but it's the fullness of the entire performance as embodied by the performer. And then I suppose Plato and Aristotle upset that when they started thinking logically and rationally, inspired by the Greek alphabet apparently. And then you get to scholastic.
Everything what you're describing is in fact exactly what medieval memorial culture was about, right?
Yes,
it's like you memorize the Psalms as a monk in order to feel yourself performing, in fact, the as the psalmist, right? And there's great meditate. I've done a paper on this where St. Francis of Assisi is famous as imitating Christ, right?
Right.
But how did he imitate Christ? What did that mean? Well, he took the words of Scripture literally. Well, which words? And what we know from Francis is he had a prayer practice of saying a sort of pastiche of Psalms that it's attributed to him, his composition, which is a curious sort of pastiche, right? It's ordered according to the divine office so that it's hours of the day, which are then mapped onto events in the Passion. And I did a little paper on this saying, why does he use these Psalms? Well, it's because in his Psalter, probably because Psalters were labeled this way, these are the Psalms that were labeled Vox Christi, the voice of Christ. Well, if you're Francis, you read these, the voice of Christ is saying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? In Psalm 21, you are performing Christ by way of saying that psalm in exactly the way that Ong is saying, the Homeric
Right.
troubadours, whatever, perform so the division between oral and literate is mistaken, largely because the concept of orality and literacy that Ong is working with is so already deeply embedded in Christianity. The mimesis of, the imitation of Christ is part of his own background when he's trying to figure out how the Greeks performed these texts.
Yeah, well, that's the idea, is that with scholasticism, I think is the right. The written word becomes once again undergirds orality, right? Like, for instance, okay, so the trivium within grammar, you have the whole idea of I guess people were learning their letters, they were learning their consonants and their vowels, and they were learning proper enunciation and diction, so as to, right, the written word was wholly subordinated to the oral speech in medieval times, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, so
within that educational,
what is that? I think it's what it sounds to me like McLuhan and Ong are writing in a period in the mid 20th century when academics are anxious, and like we always are, so whatever. But it's kind of the definition, academic anxious. Anxious about their own authority, right? And one of the things that people in the academy had authority with was training people in letters. It certainly in the 19th century, if you're the classics teacher, you are training people in Latin and Greek, and there is a certain prestige and honor to that. In the mid 20th century, that understanding of literary culture is being challenged, right, by the postmodernists, by the existentialists, by all of the post-World War II philosophies that undermine the ability, the perceived, our thought ability, I don't know, perceived, the undermine the claim that text can point to reality, right? And that is a problem of modern philosophy, not a real sense that prior to the invention of the television, people weren't talking about text. We know they were. Robert Darnton has done a lot of work on reading culture in the 18th century. One of the things we know that people used to do, like work people, was if one of their number could read, someone read a book while the women are knitting or sewing or doing their embroidery if they're upper class. You could have reading culture when in working class contexts in which if one person could read the book, the rest of them would listen while they worked, right? And so then you start recording that or projecting it on radio. It isn't actually changing the fact that people have always had this oral literate interaction with texts.
Okay, all right. So in the 1940s, McLuhan was an English professor, and he was trying to teach the classics, and the kids didn't care.
There you go.
So,
see, that's why he's feeling anxious.
Yeah, and so he started applying his analytical and poetic techniques to modern day advertisements, things that they saw around them that they weren't even paying attention to. And that was his first book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, right? Here was a guy who was analyzing the advertisement for whatever, Clorox, or as an artistic expression, right? This is how it's subliminally getting into your head. This is all this stuff, right? This is how it fills you with this feeling of being a good housewife, or needing to buy this pair of nylons and divorcing your upper torso from your bottom torso, right? All these crazy ideas. Or here's how a girdle is turning women into robots, and how the luscious ballooning wheels of a car are turning the car into a sexy woman, right? Back and forth, right? Man-machine merger. He was all about these ideas like man-machine merger, which intimately our technology was bringing about, right? And so I think this is sort of, I don't see McLuhan as fighting the postmodernists. I see him as sort of trying to explain what the postmodernists elaborated on, which was a sense that the world becomes so complicated and so connected and vast that since you can't reason your way into the forward into the future, you end up not being able to read meaning anymore, which is how dialectic becomes wrenched from grammar and rhetoric. You got people who are great at rhetoric who can convince you of anything, but they're not being logical. Or then you've got the very logical engineers, right? It's like the split in C.P. Snow's Two Cultures sort of thing. Trying to explain the split between the scientists who invent devices that all the artists are going, no, don't do it. It's going to create all this havoc, right? So, and then,
So that split. I just finished reading a wonderful book that I'm recommending to everybody. Nancy Pearcey's Saving Leonardo, which is in fact about modern art, but under explaining why there's been this split since the 18th century between reason and emotion, right? Or in Kantian terms, fact and value, right? And so the scientists claim that they're idiots and that they're wrong. We need the Middle Ages. We need the twinning of all of these things. Orality, it's in literacy, are two sides of the same coin. Reason and emotion are two sides of the same coin. Our soul, right? And so the Enlightenment fetishization of reason as the absolute answer, divorced from emotion and feeling, has a counter response in the romantics, right? Who say no, feeling is all truth and religion is all your subjective response is. So that's what we're experiencing in people's sort of I'm offended by everything thing is an intensification of the romantic valorization of the subjective. But the thing is, that only makes sense in the context of an answer to the Enlightenment conviction that reason operates without emotion, which it can't, right? That reason actually needs your emotional responses to have anything to judge about, right? That they work together. And for example, Aquinas is very good at understanding that. But what's truly missing is virtue, and we could go there because that's my current obsession in thinking about the relationship. What is it that we've lost in modern culture? And I think it's a conversation about virtue. But going back to what you're saying, what McLuhan was doing with the advertisement. So they're worried about. It's interesting. They're worried about the effects of human making on humanity, right? This is sort of the man and the machine, and how are we just becoming machines? Well, there was something else you said. There are two things that I'm still thinking that you mentioned. The problem of the way in which the word names the object and the degree to which there's a separation between the word and the object. And two, you were talking about the way now everybody's an artist, right? That we have these tools so that you can make comics and videos and books and things like that weren't accessible to people previously. Let's start with the second one. That's always been the case, right? What you're describing is the difficulty in acquiring skills to make beautiful objects or to make persuasive objects. And one of the great mysteries that Christianity articulates is we are made in the image and likeness of a maker, right? Or creator or maker, and then they do have different valences depending on whether you say creator or maker, but that medieval Christians understand that we're made in the image and likeness of an artist, right? And so that artistic response is a realization of our humanity, but it has both rational and emotional aspects that art should be beautiful, but it also should speak to the truth and to the good. The good is the virtuous, right? So we need the beautiful, the true, and the good. And in modernity, somehow we've managed to separate all those out. Say beauty is this bourgeois deception, right? It's only you only think that's beautiful or because you're participating in this oppressive culture. We don't believe in truth anymore, except for the scientifically verifiable, empirical, logical stuff, and the rest of it's all just your opinion. And who knows what's good, right? So yeah. That at least in the Middle Ages, they still appreciated that these things work in a fairly sophisticated system of interactions. Again, McLuhan and others, it's like people keep inventing new ways to make stuff. And people who are used to the old ways of making stuff get anxious when people invent new ways to make stuff.
Yes, that's it. Only the artist has the courage to look and live in the present. They're the antenna of the race. Meanwhile, everyone else lives back in the old thing, which is the content of the new. So that's verbatim McLuhan.
Well, he's right. Okay.
Yeah, the idea is that only the artist is Picasso standing there drawing these weird multi-dimensional things, going, "Oh, reality's flowing apart," while everyone else is drawing, right? Or people are watching Gunsmoke on their television, remembering the Wild West when days were simple, right? It's not right. Or
no, the days were never simple. Forget that, right? Okay, so with if you say McLuhan's writing in the 1940s, I wonder whether he read Dorothy Sayers, whose description of God as maker I was just drawing off of, because in one of her novels, which it's interesting, it's in one of her mystery novels, right? Murder Must Advertise. Her character Peter Wimsey goes undercover. Spoiler alert. And is working as a copywriter in an ad agency to uncover this drug ring. you think drug smuggling is a modern problem too. No, they had it in the 1930s. It's a coke ring that they're trying to break. Yeah. But what's fun about that is that Sayers herself had worked as a copywriter, right? So for a decade, and some of her early Peter Wimsey books, she's writing them while she's in fact working as an ad woman, right, in the 20s. So again, women are, in the creative arts, the creative industrial arts in the 20s, and Sayers was one of them. She was one of the campaigns she worked on is one of the Guinness ads. There's a toucan with a Guinness drink, right? And they've been recycling that one recently. So she was the author of some of that copy. So she has in Murder Must Advertise, there's a number of passages that are some of my favorite, where she's meditating on what it means to write this copy and create these images for describing the ideal life that the copywriters are sort of projecting onto the potential consumers. And one of the characters at one point says something like, we ask the most impertinent questions that you'd never ask, your actual friends, like, do you have body odor?
Yeah.
Do you, or hemorrhoid medicine or something, like think of any of the things that people have, their advertisers are trying to get, and they're these very probing, embarrassing questions that then you're going to solve, right? And they're projected onto these ideal types: the housewife who knows, how to clean her house properly, or the man who knows how to make good decisions about which shoes to wear and such, in order to project himself into the business world and such. That McLuhan, I think, is underestimating the degree to which people like Sayers understood what they were doing, and were. Many of them, and some of her characters in the book, there's a tension between the ones that only went to grammar school and the ones that went to Oxford or Cambridge. Those people were trained in the trivium, right? They knew how words worked. They knew how to make persuasive speech. They knew how to to use logical arguments. What's interesting is and the thing is, advertising is no more or less, evil, if you will. I mean, it only becomes evil when you start worrying about, is it bad to have stuff, right? Is it bad to participate in this made world? Is it bad to live according to certain ideals that the ad campaigns are suggesting to you? It's nothing new, right? It literally is nothing new since people started using words to persuade each other to do stuff. That goes, it's the origin of language. We use the first caveman who tried to convince people to go on a hunt with him by pointing to pictures of bison in Lascaux caves was already doing it.
Sure.
Look, we can kill the beast and eat. Yay! We'll be, that's advertising. That's persuasion.
Sure. I guess if there's a change, if there's any qualitative change, it comes from the vast increase in quantity, right? Right, you got one caveman, or you've got Madison Avenue, but today we've got I'm trying to convince you of something, and both of us have platforms, and the whole world is full of people trying to convince other people, right? The vast increase in scale, the number of, as the movement into the information economy has sort of, to what degree have we gotten away from ourselves? I think that's the questions that postmodernisms are trying to ask, and trying to humanize people who never were trained in the trivium, never were trained in rhetoric, and in a world where there's so many 8-year-olds sitting around watching PewDiePie play video games and streaming it to them, or whatever, in a world where so many people's subjectivities do lack the sort of a virtue training that you are, that your blog is largely about. How do you incorporate their subjective thought processes in a way which is so divorced from tradition without just bashing them over the head and telling them to go back to church, right? I think that's kind of...
Yes. We lack training in virtue, and I think that's more significant than the and you mentioned my blog, Fencing Bear at Prayer, and what the post that's at the top right now is Wheel of Sevens, which is a perfect example of the stuff that we're talking about, right? It's a diagram from a 14th century psalter that was actually gifted by a father to his daughter, and it's one of a number of diagrams that they're showing things like the trees of virtues and vices, the house of wisdom, the ages of man. The one that I have on my blog right now, the Wheel of Sevens, is a diagram which is a circle divided into 7 concentric rings, which are then divided by radii into a wheel, right? So spokes of the wheel. And within each of the segments of the wheel is a petition from the Lord's Prayer, right? So our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And then the other 6 sort of segments are, oh golly, and I remember them in the right order? Have I memorized my own diagram? Things like the gift of the 7 sacraments, the gifts of the Holy Spirit, the spiritual arms, the weapons of the virtues, the corporeal and spiritual works of mercy, the vices, the virtues and vices, right? And the idea is you work through the Lord's Prayer and then key it to those sacraments and gifts and virtues, so that you are. And this is, I mean, medieval education and virtue is so sophisticated, right? That you are training yourself into this whole network of associations, so that when you say, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, you should draw up the sacrament that's associated with it, the gift that's associated with it, the virtues and spiritual works that are associated with it, and so forth, so that you're this very well-crafted person, you're a well-crafted soul. That we've completely abandoned, right? We have, reason is STEM, right? It's training in mathematics, apparently.
Yeah.
Alone, right? Not that it's also training in, logical argument and so forth, because people don't seem to do that in philosophy. They just do analytic philosophy, which doesn't seem to have anything to do with actual, problems of human decisions. And we've, have emotion over here being this thing that's supposed to be unmoored from reason or virtue, just what I feel is true, and nothing left of the good, right? We have nothing left of how do we actually make ethical decisions.
I feel like, see, I grew up on the internet. I'm a total internet addict, and so
will you tell me how old you are?
I'm 29.
29. Okay.
So I got my first computer when I was 6, and I was hooked, right? And learning to touch type was terrible, because most of the most interesting conversations that I had have been textual, right? They've been silent. I'm in my room by myself, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is earlier on you were saying that we're kind of proving McLuhan wrong by having this long form oral discourse. Well, I mean, this is something that's actually very hard won for me as an ability to do, trying to find ways to adapt thoughts racing through my head, which I'm used to reading all the time, and then slowing myself down and speaking about them and finding a comfortable way to do that, right? So it took a whole...
You're right. It does take practice. It takes a lot of practice.
Right?
Yeah.
Having neglected that social element, or the embodiment of the word. Well, let's just jump straight to that, right?
See, I've got you.
yeah, right? So, I mean, that's something. Meanwhile, not everyone is going to, tear themselves down and rebuild themselves up again in some sort of trial by fire psychological thing, which is what Jordan Peterson, for instance, is trying to encourage very many people to do, to have that impinge of self-awareness and grow and change and whatnot. So that's sort of, I feel like the postmodernists are explaining this condition where people's subjectivity is rent from, right, you can be logical, or you can be emotional and gushy and triggered by everything, because the structures which make up your interpretation of reality are so flimsy that, words are violence and they tear you down every time you hear them, and you squirm with the emotional anguish of having your world destroyed by some brute like yourself. To me... Yes. Yeah, right? To me, I mean... what grammar has meant to me reading McLuhan, we have to get to the trivium eventually, but
we've touched on it, so let's get to it properly.
We have grammar as a way of reading a book and pulling meaning out of it, and then also reading nature as was instantiated by the word in the garden, right? Adam was tasked with giving names to everything, right? And so the word was enmeshed with the physical world in which we live, creation as it were. But in your terms, we live in a made world where so much of our world is human artifice.
But a garden is a made world already. Gardens are cultivated by human beings, and think about it. Adam is made and placed in a garden. He's already placed in a human environment.
Wow, of course. Well, yeah. So I mean, I'm very computer literate, and I'm not a technophobe. What I'm scared of is everyone else who doesn't understand computers but think they know what they're talking about. Right? I'm not scared of the technology. I'm scared of all the morons out there who think social media was invented when they first bought a phone, right? The internet has been the internet for decades, right? I've been growing up on the internet. As soon as all the drama started in 2014 and Milo,
can we talk about Milo?
Sure. Yes, because he was, I think, one of the reasons for his success was being sort of an embodiment of the culture of some of the expressions which had always been, readable, had always been present on the internet, but were not yet in the public psyche at large through social media access or through representation in traditional media, right? So the fact that a tabloid like Breitbart kind of straddled this gap between news in the old media sense and also through Milo, like this connection with the thriving underground scene of anonymous internet culture where nothing is tracked and no one sees it unless you go out of your way to visit these websites, which he of course found wasn't quite true, right? People wanted to go and track it and took stuff that he said out of context, which then I think has frightened people, because what you're saying is indeed I think we're living through a transition rather than a catastrophe in a lot of ways, and understanding. I mean, it's like one of the things that's happened for me. I've cut you off. Shall I say this? Please.
Okay. So Milo is my great friend, and one of the things that has happened over the last few years while I was writing about him on my blog on Fencing Bear was a number of my own colleagues in medieval history, medieval studies, will use it there, right? Not what I do. I do medieval history. Medieval studies can take care of itself. Took exception to the fact that I was writing about him and started calling me names on the internet. There's it isn't pleasant when people start calling you names, but there is a degree to which you're saying. I'm interested in what you're saying about you grew up with the computers, you're comfortable with them, but you practiced writing more than you practiced speaking. That's what I hear you say, right? That you actually practice typing your conversations much more than you practice verbal conversations. And that it's taking you. It's like you've been a hermit and you haven't practiced talking.
Yeah.
And now you're coming out into the world and having conversations with me. Good for you.
Thank you.
No, and the thing is, it does take practice, right? And what you were saying about, what Professor Peterson has been trying to encourage people to do is, go and have yourself torn down and built back up. Well, I call that training, right? Education. It's developing skills. Developing new skills is always scary and challenging. When you learn a new language, either you can learn a new language not just of like a English to Spanish or something, but going from talking about literature to talking about economics, right? One of the things that tends to happen to people, when you go through college or graduate school, the first thing you do is you find out how stupid you are, and your writing falls apart because you're suddenly trying to understand a whole new vocabulary of argument that you've never written before. That's why graduate students can't write, right? They could write. That's why we admitted them to our programs, but they're suddenly trying to write about something they don't understand yet, right? And it's like your entire grammar falls apart when you don't know the words and you don't know the structures that you should be using them and so forth. So, and that is not pleasant, right? It's like if you try to learn to play a musical instrument when you're an adult, you have to. Okay, I'm 5. Right. I'm 5 again, and I don't know what, an A sounds like, and I'm trying to be taught by my fiddle teacher what that sounds like, blah, blah, blah. So one of the things that people need to learn to do is become comfortable with feeling awkward. And that is, a lot, what I see in a lot of the social justice hysteria responses are just people that don't know what it feels like to be awkward.
To accept that that feeling in humility and deference and with hope.
Be a beginner again.
Yeah.
Right? You're just awkward, right? And Fencing Bear, to wrap this into to a bit of what okay, I just had 5 thoughts there. Fencing Bear was originally started to give me to write out some of the lessons that I was gaining from being a beginner as a fencer, right? Which what meant all of the emotions that come with being really bad at something and wanting to be good at it, being an adult, because I started when I was 38, so you have time, you can start. I started when I was 38, and it was, I knew all of this stuff, right? I'm an adult, I have a PhD, I'm, just gotten tenure at that point, so I gave myself the gift of learning a new skill, and I'm basically being beaten by 10-year-olds for a decade, right? And to be able to go into that literally into that humility and build a skill up from the ground up. That's what people need to get to be comfortable with. You cannot be a child prodigy at everything in your life. Otherwise you get only what you knew when you were 5.
Awesome. Awesome, because computer illiteracy en masse, which I've diagnosed extensively as the guy, like I'm the kid who would go around and fix all the old people's computers for $20 an hour, right? I worked as a computer technician for several years, right? I'm the person everyone wants to bring over to their house every other week to clear up the crap that, Internet Explorer infected their computer with or whatever, right? But you get this sort of false. Everyone praises the person who understands computers, and they don't know what they're talking about. So when you say child prodigy, that immediately made me think any kid with half a clue about how to clear up your Android phone gets an unlimited amount of praise and astonishment, and oh, you're so smart. He's such a brilliant person with the computers. Oh, you should. Oh my God, right? There's this free. Every kid who understood a computer was a child prodigy at, in the 90s and 2000s and the 80s even, right? And it really wasn't that impressive what they could do. It really wasn't worth the right. I think this is a massive generational problem owing to this, right? Because what you just said there, really, you can't be a prodigy at everything, but it's so easy to gain praise and acceptance and rewards for having half a clue about how modern technology works, then it's an imposter syndrome, right? Because you're an imposter. Like I know I'm not that great, but I'll take the credit, right? I'll take the money.
Well, good. You have a skill that people find valuable. That's great, right? You don't need to apologize for that. But so I've got 8 layers still in there. Milo, that one of the things that happened, and this is, I think we are in a learning process as a culture about what it means to have all of this stuff available digitally and in text or in visual. And one of the sort of interesting things that happened over the course of my writing about Milo was people were calling me all these names and screenshots, right? It's like, do you people understand what it means to archive this sort of conversation? And so people would be having these little Twitter fests, apparent, to their mind, hidden from me, right? Because A, I didn't know how to use Twitter, and then B, they had blocked their accounts. But what I did was I had friends who were helping me collect information because they could see stuff. They sent it to me. I archived it. Do not pick a internet fight with a historian. Just saying. Because no, seriously, they would
Sure.
write it up this summer. We just had the whole archive, right? And so, and of course what he learned after doing those live streams, which are then permanent, which then can be taken in clips and placed out of context and lies turned up about them and stuff, is the flip side of all of this is an ephemera, right? This is permanent, right? Once you say something on the internet, somebody's taking a screenshot of it. Just believe that, right? And whether it's in a private conversation or a public conversation, it's recorded in a more permanent way. Even what we're doing now, right? You're going to post it online, and therefore people will be able to take it. And what I have found is it's also not to Jordan's credit, I'm afraid to say, taken this and what the other thing that happens once you've recorded yourself and put yourself out there on video is people can go back and rewatch it, right? Over and over and over again. And one of the things that I think is going to happen, for example, this woman who was on Milo's show this winter who does body language readings. Bombard. Oh, what does she call herself? Bombard body language. I should remember this. She'll take video clips of people, and you realize the more video we get out there, the more sort of unguarded and unscripted stuff also gets out there. But it's recorded in a way that you can go back through and you can do exactly what I would do with a text previously, now with these kind of videos. And it's not just like scripted movies. This is beyond film criticism, right? This is Bill Clinton making
It's extemporaneous.
Bill Clinton making faces as he's sitting behind the singers at Aretha Franklin's funeral, right? And we are going to have a new way of becoming expert at reading each other's gestures, facial expressions, intonation, performances, which we've always been good at, but now it's going to be replayable. And that, I think, never mind oral and literate, right? The ability to go back over someone's spoken performance in the same way that we've been able to go back over their written performance, that is going to be very interesting.
Absolutely. As soon as the instant replay was invented in the mid-'60s, McLuhan started asking all these sports players, like footballers, how has the television instant replay changed the way you play the game? And they had, it literally changed the way the game was played. Just the fact that people were able to go over stuff, right? So it's the way that media and recordings of people influence us and influence the constitution of a person, right? If all of my expression is through a mediated form, then that's, I feel like that's sort of the thing which the postmodernists most have a point about, which is most overlooked when it's so very easy to live in this anthropomorphic world where it's like, hey, we're all talking to each other and then we got this technology. But I've been trying to consider and render cyberspace as a space which could be more vibrant, and people can inhabit cyberspace. Like, I was an internet addict, right? Just as well as they can inhabit the physical world, right? And so these are the sort of issues that
well, and so that is less of a problem than you think. Okay, so still Milo, because he's a great example for everything.
Yes.
And lovely to look at. That he's lovely to look at, and what you're saying, he brought this internet culture out into it's visible, right? That is one of the things that he understands better than anybody else, how important the visual performance is. And so I've been writing stuff for ages, right? But being able to do these videos and talk to people, that transforms my own work, right? It's like, you're going to go, if you read my blog now, you'll hear me in a way that you couldn't if you were just reading it before, right? It's just text, right?
Right.
That you're saying you're worrying about sort of living in your head and living in the fantasy. Well, I do that all the time. It's called history, right?
Sure. Yes.
I live in the Middle Ages, right?
Yes,
I can tell you things but I have to imagine myself into it. And another of the things that happened when I started writing about Milo was I saw him playing with, because he grew up Catholic and grew up very well educated in a lot of this symbolic language, he can do it visually and verbally in a way that I, as a medievalist, picked up on instantly, right? People still think I'm crazy because I say, well, he's embodying this mimesis of this particular hero character, Jesus. That because he's in fact living as a Christian in the true medieval sense of the word, which is, as Francis did, taking on the truth that then you speak through your own performances, right? And I know that people find that challenging. He just published an interview yesterday with Patrick Coffin, which I think everybody should watch because it explains some of this more fully as he understands it. If you're worried about living in your fantasy world, well, I do that anyway, but I get paid for it, and I'm called a scholar.
Right. I think
because I'm good at writing history.
Yes, of course. This oral world is what McLuhan would call acoustic space, and so Paul Levinson, who's a media scholar, likes to describe the internet as acoustic space. And so my point is, for you to live in the medieval ages reconstituted in your imagination, right? That's a private act between you and the history books and the relics of the time. Whereas for me on the internet, they're actually, right, the books talk back. It's a textual conversation.
I know, it's so fun.
Right. And this has only been around since the invention of modems, or teletypes, actually, right? So this is like a 50, right. 60, 70-year young thing, right?
Well, the telegraph, people spoke back with that.
The telegraph, yeah. I've done a whole video on the telegraph, actually.
Oh, yeah?
As a precursor to the internet. So the fact that my imagination is now, it's just as imaginative and out of body as reading a book, except there are other living human souls who are subject to my machinations, insofar as I talk to them and might convince them. You had an excellent post on your blog about a troll on your blog who's psychoanalyzing you and knows just the right thing to say to get under your skin. And you said wow, you read deeply. Right. And so, and it's just a voice. You don't know who they are. You don't know nothing about them. So all it is this disembodied. You said it was like a demon and you needed an exorcist at the end, I think is how you closed the blog post.
A troll of my very own.
A troll of your very own. Yeah. Isn't it nice that there's someone out there who cares enough out there to study you just to know what it is to stab you in the heart, right? Like...
Yes. Yes. No, you're right. And the thing is, so the demon imagery is one. I'm kind of serious about that. I think people do channel's the wrong word. That's a different spiritual vocabulary. That angels and demons are real. How they're real is this challenging meditation in Christian history, because even back in antiquity, there was a sense that the demons are both interior and exterior, right? There are thoughts and sort of temptations, but they also were spiritual forces that we are in battle with. I have had a number of interactions. I had one recently on my Facebook where the human soul kept signing himself with the devil emoji, and I'm like, okay, who are you? They are, so this is I mean, I think, and again, people obviously have had these sorts of interactions with each other for a long time. It's like when someone really comes at you in this insulting way, that it can happen anonymously in this way. That maybe, I mean, I'm undoing most of the novelty of what you're suggesting, but that I don't know, right? The anonymity of this kind of attack is very curious. I love what you're saying about, I type something and I get a response back. Clearly, if you found the troll in my very own post, you've read very far back in the archive. But I did a post this summer on Game of Threads where I was saying, I don't play video games. Oh, wait, who am I kidding?
I read that. Yes, Facebook was the video game. The ping of dopamine every time. Yeah, exactly.
And I in the post I'm playing like, wait, I have to answer this, right? That it's clearly this is very energizing, right? It's like someone tweets something and you answer it, and it's like it's a game, it's a video game, but it also has moves, and this is where the rhetoric comes in. So just to define the trivium, right? Grammar in the medieval understanding it's what you said. It's learning your alphabet, learning your vowels, learning your syllables, how they make up words, the parts of speech. It's also learning pronunciation, right? And it's sort of being able to read out loud is part of grammatical instruction, and it is also, as your same McLuhan said, it's understanding the text, right? The one of the grammatical exercises I do a course on the trivium. If you want it, you can put maybe you post my syllabus for that course in your links, where one of the things we do is we read through the Martianus Capellus Marriage of Mercury and Philology, which is the sort of medieval textbook on the 7 liberal arts. And then I have the students do different exercises. They have to come up with an exercise that then fulfills the problem of that discipline. And the grammatical exercise that typically we do is writing an introduction to the author. It's an excessus ad auctorem, where you are saying, the title of the work, its mode of philosophy, its manner of treating its subject, and so forth. There's several different structures of excessus that medieval commentators use. So you're sort of basic literary criticism, right? But from the level of being able to pronounce the words correctly, define the parts of speech, to being able to say what the text is about and give a little summary of it and rewrite it in your own words and things like that. Then rhetoric is the art of persuasion. It's the art of, they're basically the 5-paragraph essay that most students are taught in American schools is a Ciceronian structure, right? That you sort of set up the capture your audience's attention, explain what you're going to talk about, give the points that you're going to make, summarize it. All of that comes from its deep training in ancient rhetoric. But the thing that people think mostly about rhetoric is how do you get people to listen and change their minds? Well, Cicero back in antiquity knew how to do that in his legal orations, and that's mainly what he was teaching people to do, how to give court speeches, like courtroom speeches. So, I mean, one of the great places that people do still learn to do that is in law school, hopefully. Our great drama in America is the courtroom, right? Is the battle of truth and evidence, and guilt, presented properly by these orators, the lawyers, to the jury, who then has to judge, right? So that's one of our high rhetorical forms. And then dialectic or logic is, properly speaking, the use of syllogisms to make well-constructed arguments. In Martianus, he has these. Each of these three are given allegorical personifications. So grammar is there with her medicine box and her knife for cutting out bad syllables and things like that. Rhetoric is quite beautiful and can capture all the gods with her diction. Dialectic, interestingly, she's got this. There's a hook and a snake. I can't remember. It's like she sort of captures you with her argument, brings you in, and then the snake bites you.
Yeah.
So it gets, it's like it captures you she captures you in her coils, and you can't escape if, in fact, she's constructed her argument properly.
And Mercury cuts her off at the end of the chapter,
Yes.
and he's just like, listen, if you keep talking, you're just going to like bamboozle everyone, and we're not going to be able to reason ourselves out anymore, and you're just weaving
Right.
deeper and deeper logical constructs that are just driving everyone crazy, right? So,
Yes.
Yeah.
So what was I talking about before I gave you the trivium? Phooey. And if we could look back on the video, we could figure it out, and then I could recover what I was actually talking about. Yeah, I know. I got caught in the coils of Martianus, which is it's a little bit like Martianus. He's not a great poet, right? And he's sort of writing in late antiquity. It's apparently a textbook written for his son. It's meant to be a sort of introductory thing, but it's at a fairly high level of introduction, right? It's not an easy book to read, and it becomes the model for education more in the Carolingian period, when people like Remigius of Auxerre write commentaries on it, partly because it's so hard to read. It's more notional as a textbook, really, by the later Middle Ages than actual, that people like the idea of the 7 liberal arts and like the personification allegories, so they'll be represented in art. But there are later books that are written in the 12th century that are better at introducing things like grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Mm-hmm. So it's only a partial introduction there. But now I was really talking about something else. The trivium. Well, go where you want to with this.
All right. What do you?
Writing back. The writing back. Oh yes, now I remember the writing back. So one of the things I've used the internet for, the social media, particularly like Facebook, and now I am actually on Twitter. Forgive me. Oh my God. Is practicing, just literally recognizing that this is a practice, right? This is, I need to train my emotions for when those trolls come after me and say, the shame is a very common technique that these trolls use, regardless. I mean, it doesn't matter. They're social justice warrior trolls. They're conservative trolls. They're just trolls, right? And they come in and they make ad hominem arguments all the time, right? How dare you support Milo? Don't you know he's a sodomite? And I'm like, well, yes. He kind of talks about it, but maybe he says things that you don't think he says because you need to listen to him, right? But and there's a lot of that from both sides. It's like, don't you know how dare you? How can you possibly? And I'm like, well, I don't think you're listening to him. And training yourself not to react in the terms that the troll is trying to get you to react, it's very good. It's like fencing, right? They're standing there with their blade going like this. It's not a threat. That is a threat. Know how to parry it, right? And I do that in the game of Threads when I talk about that as, it's a fun game because it's like real life bouting, right? I need an answer, but it's delayed, right? It's like you can just walk away and figure out what the better answer is. You don't have to do it right then because it's still there, right? So walk away, think about it, see, and you get better at those responses. And you also get better at staying calm, which is obviously one of the things. I think what happened is all this social media exploded on everybody. They had no practice with this sort of interaction, and everybody got hysterical. And we will get better at it if people understand it as a particular kind of skill.
Right, I agree. And for now, the people with practice have been, everyone who was first incentivized to say, screw society, I'm going to go sit in my room all day and spend time on the computer where I can have more interesting conversations. So, I mean, when social media came in about 10 years ago, they were encroaching all these unprepared people who have no idea what the internet was like. They're encroaching on an environment which was already predisposed to people who were antisocial to begin with. So I think that's kind of where you get... if Milo is a representation of the more vituperous or venomous spirit of the pre-internet culture,
he's neither vituperative nor venomous. He's entirely sweet.
But his delivery,
he's just provocative.
Yes, but his delivery, right? He still is acting as a channel for the sort of the pent-up emotion of this space, which is invaded by all the normies in the past 10 years who didn't know what they were doing and are now getting fleeced, as it were, by
yes, they are. They came into a conversation in which they were bouting with A-level fencers, and they're mad.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and that's exactly what I think. That's exactly what happened in 2014, where the relatively unknown history of the internet with its flame wars. The flame wars have been seasonal on the internet, and they've been seasonal for 20 years, from my own experience. Right? Everyone is right? There just comes in waves. There's a massive argument and drama explodes, and if you didn't know that, then as soon as 2014 comes along and you start, right, and all these people who just, Steve Jobs stole their cell phone and stuck a computer in their pocket, but called it a phone so that they didn't even know what they were getting into, right? It's just a new cell phone, right? And no, it's not just a new cell phone. It's a portal to this massive informational, dialectic that's been going on behind your back. You didn't even know it was happening, right? So as the world blindly stumbled into internet culture and got bamboozled because they rightly and justly defended feminism from the evil misogynists, or they rightly and justly stood up for right to their own conception of having grown up in proper old media society, right? The fight has been so detrimental that all sorts of things have happened in this transitional period.
That's well said. Yes, yeah. And I think it's my fencing analogy. I think is I like it because I fence. It's when you start fencing, and this is what Fencing Bear was talking about. The emotional training I had to go through. The top level one is of course envy, right? What you come in, and certainly as an adult, and what you're So I'm 53, and you're describing growing up at the internet. Well, so did I, right? There are those of us my age who, got the Apple. We had the first Apple computers on campus back in 1983, because Apple's the little boxy ones were they were already starting to make deals with the universities to help promote their hardware to the campuses. And so I had one, the early Apples, and, I grew into the internet as it grew. Right. So, lots of things that my students don't understand, for example, how to search a catalog, are easy for me because I remember the thing that the catalog was based on, which was the card catalog. And therefore, if the search terms are going to be structured according to fields that we used to have to learn using those cards. Now I have plenty of students who come to me and they say, well, I want to work on such and such. And I'm like, well, did you look in the catalog? And they're like, no. And I'll, type something up and show it to them. And they're like, how did you find that? Right. So there are ways in which the new technological culture, as with the Gutenberg thing, old printed books looked like manuscripts, right? And in order to read them, you had to know things about manuscripts that modern readers don't tend to know, like the abbreviations that they used and certain formatting elements and such. It's similar with the digital world, right? It's like a lot of the digital world is still layered on top of an architecture that was developed in the print world. And those of you who only know the digital may not know that, and therefore can't find things in it that I could. Right? I didn't know things about the chat rooms and I do know who PewDiePie is, but not because I've ever watched him. So there are different layers even of the internet that have grown up, and I can find stuff on the. This is what has also been funny about my colleagues attacking me in my own field, that I can find things on the internet apparently better than they can sometimes, and they're angry at me for being good at it. Right? It's like, no, we were the ones who were doing the digital stuff. What are you out there? You backward traditionalist.
How dare you be able in modernity as a traditionalist?
Right. And I say, because I'm a medievalist, you guys should know this, right? That medievalists should also be familiar with this problem of the transition in the media, right? Because that's where medieval Christians invented the printing press. Thank you very much. And the first things they started printing were Bibles and prayer books. So.
Absolutely. That point you made about yes, all of the metaphors afforded by the graphical user interface, like the idea of having files and having a filing cabinet and having paper folders, right? Those were all to aid the transition of people into the digital concept space, headspace, because, before that it was, okay, here's a computer, go learn BASIC and go program it to do what you want, right? And then it was like, no.
I did. I made a little guy dance. I was very excited about that.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah,
1979 or thereabouts. Anyway, so the fencing thing is like you come as an adult to this new skill field, and you see people who start the same age you do and do better faster, or you can think your way into these problems, but you can't physically execute them, right? It was incredibly frustrating. My younger people who were training with me could just pick it up like that, and I'm like, oh my god, I can't see what you're describing. And there's a lot of I read back in those days, I read a lot of things like chess and martial arts and things like that. It's like, how do you get inside the space of seeing the move? I can think it, but I can't see it or perform it, right? I think what's happened with a lot of the hysteria around a lot of this internet interaction is indeed what we said before, that this group of newbies, which I understand you don't say anymore, staggered into a field of experts and then got angry at the experts.
Mm-hmm. And the experts might have been experts in, causing shit on the internet and inciting people for drama for the laughs, right? It's
exactly
a lot of trolling, right? And I'm used to that. That's the normal state of affairs here. But right. So as it exploded, it's interesting. You say, how do you get into that headspace? Well, it's about slowly inscribing an intuitive feel for it through repetition, and that can be repetition of the abstract thoughts, which is typographical in McLuhan speak, literate, right? You don't just say the rosary once, you say it a million times until it right? Like, the repetition is what inscribes that intuitive feel, and that's the training, I suppose, or the practice.
Yes,
right?
yes.
So to move from a new fencer into being an able one takes the 10 years of inscribing within your more kind of getting underneath of your conscious processes until you've got it by rote memory. Like, I was in Taekwondo, right? So I get the idea, right? And
this is why the orality literacy thing doesn't stand up, because I could talk about it much more fluently than I could before I could do it. I barely write about fencing anymore because I can do it, right? At least based on my tournament results, I seem to have been okay, right, at it. That you can start a literate ability to talk through what it is I should do in order to, not be thinking the action and stuff like that. Once you can think the action and not, the verbal goes away. It's very interesting, right? There's that you become, I've become and that's why you talk to athletes or musicians or mystics, and you're trying to get inside their experience of what it's like to, play that piece or make that particular parry. Often they can't articulate it, right? It's like they don't need to anymore because it's somewhere but it's not just in their body, right? It's also in their understanding. It's in a perceptual capacity to see the right thing. And as far as they'll just say, well, I just pay attention and I do the right thing, right? And you're like, how?
Well, you've got chess and you've got fencing as these pre-established fields where there already are accredited experts who will provide you the terminology necessary for you to be conscious at every stage of your development. And once you think through what you're doing and you get used to it, you can, you don't throw the words away, but you don't need them anymore on the tip of your tongue to be associated with whatever it is you're learning. I think for internet experience, for dwelling in a world of constant connection on the internet, we don't yet have any sort of accredited experts to go and teach people how to not feed the trolls, right? It's all still very this primordial folklore with all this weird jargon. No one knows what the hell, right? Like 3 years ago, I was running around going, "Don't feed the trolls," and no one really knew what that meant, right? Because we had guides to it was called netizenship, right? Be a good netizen, right? And always lurk in a web forum and learn the style before you start participating. And like the folklore of how to exist sanely on the internet has not been disseminated yet, and so we still, in
fact, the training in virtue.
Yeah. So until and I think this should be the role of humanities and academia in the 21st century. If you're going to learn something in school, it should be how to behave yourself in a world where you can reach through a screen and impact millions of people, and you never know what the hell's going to randomly pluck you up and throw you into fame as though you were, as you become, the locus of attention for whatever. And that's what the internet is, right? One person bumbles around and they're enough of a clown that a million people notice and their YouTube channel blows up overnight for all the wrong reasons, right? Everyone wants to poke.
So that could happen in the past too. There's celebrity culture, for example, in the 18th century that Casanova writes very vividly about, right? The sort of being able to be picked up and transformed. The celebrity culture there was, if you're picked up by the aristocratic courts, and what we've done is democratize that, I think, right? That you can suddenly be a celebrity for a quirk very, very quickly, right? And indeed that is again, it maps onto previous human experience. But I think I like what you're saying about netizens, and you wanted to come in and don't feed the trolls and such. In my thinking of training, I picked up the William F. Buckley phrase of happy warrior, right? It's indeed how to take on this kind of combat, verbal, emotional, and be cheerful about it, right? It's like, and you could say be a good sportswoman, sportsman, somehow recognizing that you're in this human engagement of social expertise. And there are people that, again, like in the 18th century, wit was a very great, if you were witty like Casanova, right? He's basically nobody, and manages to worm his way into all these different. Rousseau did it too. Worm his way into all these different courts simply by virtue of his quick tongue and beauty, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if school's going to be preparing people for living in the real world, then it needs to teach people about the substance of the world that they're entering into. And I mean, in reality, you've got all these subcultures, and you've got all these discussions happening and things you can be exposed to on the internet that would never be taught in a classroom, at least to my conception, right? I think that's the big divide.
Well, okay, so grammar, rhetoric, and logic, the best, if you really want to think about them as training for now, Dorothy Sayers, whom I mentioned before with her novel, did a nice essay called The Lost Tools of Learning. You can find it on the internet. And she talks through this, like grammar she has this sort of fictionalized version of the way she thought medieval education worked. And it's a nice story, but it's not exactly the way it worked, but that's okay. That at the grammatical level, you need to learn stuff, right? Facts, right? And she says that this works well at the age when you're most likely to be enjoying learning lists. You need dates and names of, historical events. You need the names of all the animals, like Adam, naming all the animals, right? You need names of continents. You need, political entities. You need to the multiplication tables, grammar, all of that. Learn that in grammar school, right? It's like lots and lots of memorization, because people cannot structure their thought without content. And that is one of the great failures of modern education. They gave up thinking memorization was bad, right? It's like, no, we could not be having this conversation if you and I hadn't read stuff and remembered it, right? It's nonsense to say that you can think without filling your mind with stuff, right? You need materials to work with, and you need to know particular things. If we can't have conversations in our present cultures because people don't know similar stuff, I mean, you could talk about PewDiePie, and that's the limit of my knowledge on that.
Sure.
I can tell you about, Rupert of Deutz and Richard of Saint Laurent and Catherine of Siena and so forth. You don't know what I'm talking about, right? We need common knowledge in order to be having a fruitful and engaging conversation. Shared stories, shared repertoire of narratives, right? All of that, start with that. And then she says, at the next stage, you really like arguing, right? She's like middle school, right? That's when you learn dialectic, when you need to know how to make well-formed refutations of suggestions and propositions and so forth like that. And so, the middle years of schooling are good for that kind of training. And then once you now are filled with knowledge, you have practiced making arguments, rhetoric comes along, and you can start making persuasive and beautiful speech, and be trained in style and prose and poetry, and in our vocabulary now, you should learn how to make videos and comic books. And I have a course that I do on Tolkien, where I invite people to make art in different ways, and like lots of different genre of art that you can apply these skills of persuasion and beautiful presentation to. And if we thought about education in those terms, people's minds would be filled with good knowledge, right? Stuff that's worth memorizing. And what you think that is, obviously, that's a cultural negotiation. What stories do you think your children should know? What histories do you think they should be told? We do need to talk about that and figure that out as a culture. And then practice arguing and practice presenting them well and persuasively. And then the problem that McLuhan is worrying about, whether or not people are like overly persuaded by ads, goes away, because people are literate in the
techniques that would be used on them otherwise, right? Right. And of course, McLuhan's writing in the 40s. Obviously, that's a period in which very highly skilled rhetoricians are using very powerful rhetoric to do stuff more than just sell washing powder. Most of our political vocabulary comes from the Nazis. I mean, who's Nazis? Well, basically everyone has modern political rallies with banners, right? If you see The Triumph of the Will, if you see Leni Riefenstahl's movie, it's the first time I saw it, it was like, oh my gosh, I've seen this movie before, because you've seen the visual techniques that she developed in her cinematography constantly, right? It doesn't matter whether you're Democrat, Republican, AFD in Germany, or whatever Labour Party in England. They're all using the same vocabulary of rallies, of speeches on a stage with big banners in the background. You want to know who Nazis are? They're everybody right now, because we're all in this visual vocabulary of persuasion. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How's that terrifying? Well, thanks for putting it so directly. All right, yeah, get that off the table. Yes.
I love being a medievalist. I can trigger everybody.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, as soon as you get radio, now you have this broadcast medium, and that's exactly the environment in which this modern, I think that's actually capital M, the modern, form of persuasion of politics of nationalism, all right, that still organizes, I guess, our societies even today, right? Yeah.
Oh, very much so. But we, as having these individual conversations, I mean, the ground up network that you grew up in, and that is very powerful and very dangerous to those big political performances, right? It's and that's why they keep trying to shut us down. The more that those of us who can practice these skills can look at the big performances and see what they are. I mean, obviously, it's like the ritual of the church, I think is for good, and the Vatican II gave us some problems, and we need to get rid of that and go back. No, anyway, we do. But to understand what those cathedrals were meant for as statements of reality, as opposed to the statements of reality that we are inhabiting in modern secular culture. Oh yes, I think this is a very important. I would say argument. It's bigger than an argument. It's like we must push back. But one of the ways we can do it is in practicing these sorts of conversations among each other in this dispersed network of the internet.
Right. Well, yeah, here's where it starts. I agree, because eventually this dialectic has to, because that's what the internet is. It's been this parallel world of dialectic and discussion, of everyone checking out of their real life to go bitch about what everyone's wrong about on the internet, right? So for 20 years, everyone with a beef about something in contemporary secular society has, taken some time out of their day to go vent their private thoughts with everyone who agrees with them. Yeah, everyone else is wrong, right? So this dialectic, this whole conversation has been brewing. And now that the old world of media and academia and is violently clashing with this ground up culture which has been hidden away for so long, and now that they're mixing around, right, eventually the conversations which were happening amidst the people in what gets labeled a populist sense, right? Mm-hmm. The list of grievances that everyone has built up for the past few decades eventually does need to be resolved back within the institutions of civilization if we're going to keep civilization around, which I think is a good idea. Right? And so that's where, I'm not at the point where I want to make value judgments about any ideology or the other, but I'm very supportive of having, I
am Christianity, but
right on. And so I'm happy to talk to you. I mean, I think I'm very capable of steel manning the postmodern arguments and sort of the secular, I'm an atheist, I'm a rational, skeptical atheist
I don't
guy.
know that phrase. What's steel man? Steel man.
That's a phrase. It's the opposite of straw manning. I could role play a very convincing postmodern person if the situation demanded it, right? Even if I don't agree with, right? That's something that Jordan Peterson has been elaborating with the other people in the intellectual dark web, like Sam Harris and stuff. That they're trying to practice really demonstrating an understanding of your opposition before you begin engaging them, so as to demonstrate your intellectual rigor or honesty or forthrightness, right? And I think that's
that's good practice.
Yeah.
That's good practice.
Yeah. So so you're right. The sort of conversations we're having here on YouTube that I'm will eventually, as folk culture, ought to eventually inform something a little more a new field of a way to a body of knowledge that's authoritative on how to conduct yourself properly and safely on the internet, in the same way that there's already existing bodies of knowledge in every other field, right? Who's going to write the training curriculum? Well, it's going to be whoever does is going to be drawing on the tumult which we're experiencing today, right? Mm-hmm. So
yes,
I'm happy to be part of. You know what? We should wrap it up.
I think it's a good place to wrap up.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining me as we plant the seeds of understanding of just what our modern day crazy environment is. I can just sit down, wake up, grab a cup of coffee, and talk to you across the North American continent, and we can have this little chat. It's wonderful.
It's wonderful.
So thank you very much for joining me, Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, who is a medievalist from the University of Chicago. You can visit her blog, Fencing Bear. I'll put a link down below. Fencing Bear at
prayer.
At prayer. Fencing Bear at prayer. And
yes. And I should say but they've scolded me because I forget to when I'm talking about myself, I get like Milo. I actually have some friends, and we'd love to have you on to talk with us. Three Creators Symposium is our YouTube channel, and we do, instead of one-on-one interviews, we have a group discussion, like a symposium, and it would be great to have you come.
I would be my pleasure. Thank you very much. All right. Thanks to everyone watching at home. I have to plug, I've got a Patreon. So far, I've got 2 pledges. I make $6 a month on the internet with this venture so far. And you know, it's $6 a month more in my pocket than I had when I started. But
it's a cup of coffee you need to get this started. Yes,
it is. So I just want to remind everyone of that. And otherwise, stay safe out there when you're going it alone in the media world, when you're living in the phone. Goodbye.